Hello, it's Zoe here, your friendly neighborhood Canadian-Australian leadership expert. And we are wrapping up the season on holacracy, which I always want to say with a sing-song, holacracy. It's such a cool word. And we're also looking at polarities, which I think are central and important to how we do holacracy if we're going to do holacracy, and also important to leadership in general. So we're going to take big words like holacracy and polarities and make them simple. Okay, let's do it.
Welcome to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast, where we share all things people stuff in leadership. Learn from leaders who have done the hard yards and learn from experience. Hear from expert authors about the latest insights from culture to strategy and messy people dynamics. Get tips and insights from multiple award-winning author and leadership expert herself, Zoe Routh. Now, on with the show.
So we had a number of different interviews looking at independent teams and what's required to run teams well, whether you use teams in a holacracy type of environment. Well, what is holacracy? It's a management system that aims to eliminate hierarchy. Well, reduce it anyway. It is a process to manage decision-making in an organization. Those are some elements of it. And in the various discussions with interviewees and in my own research and reading, I've established, or I've come to conclude, that if you're going to run an organization in a management system like holacracy, where it's very devolved or delegated power and autonomy, then there's some prerequisites you need in your people in order to be able to do that. So how do we get teams and individuals within teams to be able to make decisions, speak up, and contribute to the whole? The first thing to consider is their leadership maturity. Do they actually have the worldview and capabilities and insight in order to address the challenges at hand? And for some teams, that's yes, and for some teams, that's no. And depending on what stage of leadership maturity they're at, you might have to do some development with those individuals. For example, the diplomats might need to have some encouragement on learning how to speak up. And this is all, as I've also been reflecting and learning, this is all very culturally embedded as well. There is some systemic racist issues that are involved in many different organizations that are unconscious biases, essentially. In that, I was talking to someone about their public school upbringing versus private school upbringing. In private schools, there is a huge emphasis on encouraging students to develop opinions, to speak up, to debate. In many public schools, they haven't had the same kinds of opportunities like meeting decision makers, meeting powerful people, going to different countries, being exposed to adults in very influential roles. And so the ability or the practice of speaking your mind has not been everybody's opportunity. And if you come from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, i.e., not white Australia, this may be also problematic and challenging because you might have an initial language barrier to overcome in the first instance. And then you might have some systemic prejudices to overcome as well, which can keep people from speaking up. And speaking up and voicing opinion is actually central to the success of holacracy. So all these things need to be considered if you are considering going for a devolved management style or system where the teams are fairly autonomous in making decisions. So leadership maturity is the first thing to consider within the systemic context in which you find yourself. The second thing to consider is capability. Do the individuals and the team as a whole have the capabilities to actually handle the complexity in which their team operates? Do they have the ability to do things like facilitate a conversation, to generate ideas, to challenge status quo, to evaluate options, to make decisions using decision-making frameworks? These are central to the nuts and bolts of managing a team, and especially team decision-making. If those don't exist, then your first order of business after leadership maturity is developing those capabilities in your team members. And the last aspect of setting up your team and teams for a holacracy or autonomous-like operation are boundaries. We need to be really clear about how people and where people operate. And this is baked into the holacracy constitution and its designations, that each circle has its prerogatives and priorities and responsibilities. And I think alongside of that, if you're in a conventional organization and you want to build more autonomous teams, you're not going to jump, I wouldn't suggest, straight to holacracy. You need to establish these protocols rigorously, so it's spelt out and pretty clear where teams can make decisions and where they cannot, and why. This is also a process that's important for the leader. And if you're an organization that still has leadership authority and titles, this is really important, because what I've found in my discussion with leaders is that giving up power and control is challenging. All of us like to be in control. All of us like to have some sort of rule over our own domain and responsibilities. And leaders are no different. And when we come into a place of responsibility, accountability, control comes hand in hand with that. And allowing our teams to make more decisions can, well, let's face it, freak us out. So putting in some boundaries helps everybody play more easily and better with one another, with accepted limits of risk taking. That's probably a good way to put it. So why go about doing all this anyway? Well, autonomy is a powerful thing. People, as I said, love to have control of their world, their work, and sometimes we love to have power over others, which is a competitive concept to the idea of holacracy, where it's a team of equals, and it's about the power of the idea as opposed to the power of the individual or the role. That's important here. So this is what I've come also to think about in mulling over holacracy and leadership. I believe leadership is a web of tensions to manage. The ability to handle polarities, which is essentially tensions, and polarities are things that look like opposites but are complementary. These are central to the heart of enjoying and managing autonomy or team autonomy. So what do I mean by all that? What I mean, managing tension is critical, central to our roles as leaders. Things like freedom and control, they look like opposites, and yet they're complementary. So the opposites of autonomy and accountability, they look like opposites, but they're actually complementary. These are examples of polarities. And as leaders, our role is to identify what the tensions are if we're trying to elevate our team responsibilities and give them more autonomy, is what is the pushback. And the first thing we do is map out the excesses of each of the poles. So the excess of autonomy is just chaos, and the excess of accountability is stifling micromanagement. And then not enough autonomy leads to boredom and frustration, and not enough accountability leads to, throwing up your hands and just going, well, whatever, blame games. So a balance is what's needed. This is what Brian Emerson calls the third way. And we had a great podcast interview with him last year on the show, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And he talked about this third way, where you map out the tensions, and then you have to ask the question, how do we find a third way where we balance those two tensions? So if we look at those two examples, freedom, control, and autonomy and accountability, we come up with controlled freedom. So that sounds like an oxymoron, controlled freedom. But essentially, it's what we all want. We want the freedom to make decisions, to create, and in order to make decisions and to create, those parameters, those constraints actually help generate better decisions and better creativity. So controlled freedom is the third way through freedom and control. And not surprisingly, accountable autonomy is the third way in balancing the polarity of autonomy and accountability. Accountable autonomy, which means you have plenty of room to make your own decisions, and this is what you are also accountable, and this is what it looks like. So I love this idea of playing with polarities and tensions as a way to build more autonomy in your teams, whether you go down a full-blown holacracy route with all of its management system and structures and protocols, or whether you just seeking to empower your teams so that you too can grow as a leader, so that you can put your energy and your grist into something that's developing something bigger so that you are also challenged. What I've come to decide or conclude about all these mullings, I guess, is there is no one way. There is no one path to leadership. And there are guiding lights. So I have 5 guiding lights that can help all of us make choices about the kinds of things that we want to do in our leadership, the ways that we want to run our organizations and teams. And the first guiding light is this, is to ask the question, what am I creating and why? And what does that look like? This is our big why. What is our purpose? What is our calling? So what am I creating? What are we creating together? And this is a guiding light to the future. That's the first one. The second one is asking ourselves, are we in service to others? In the work that we're doing, in the actions that I'm taking, am I in service to others? And that helps pivot our focus away from self, where we can fall prey to power traps, and firmly on others, where we can stay in service and in humility and curiosity. The third guiding light is asking ourselves, is our work adding and contributing to the whole? Is our work adding and contributing to the whole? Or is it taking? So this is a guiding light for our choices there. Our fourth guiding light is, do our choices and actions uplift or harm others? Sidebar, obviously you want it to uplift and not harm others. In case I needed to point that out as a guiding light. You never know who's listening. And the number 5 guiding light is that kindness and appreciation will always serve us well. This is a really important one. I think when in doubt, be kind. When in doubt, if you're not sure what to do, appreciate the person around you. And this really is a call out, like, don't wait for other people. Be the light. Light the fire. Don't stand around waiting for somebody else to strike the match. You do it. You take control. You have a go. Be the one who actually lights up others. Be that guiding light yourself. We all have it in us, and sometimes we don't know that's what's in us. So a further word on kindness, and it came as a result of a conversation I had just this morning, actually. I received a Facebook Messenger message from somebody from my summer camp world way back in the 1980s. That sounds so far away. My summer camp counselor from 1984, her name is Patsy. She reached out to me and said, hey, I've been seeing all your stuff. Love what you're doing. I'm moving into coaching myself. She's doing intergenerational trauma coaching and is really working with emotions and hypnotherapy. And she's amazing. She's an amazing human being. And she just reached out and wanted to have a conversation about coaching and professional development and leadership. So I first met Patsy in 1984. Yep, when I was a kid at summer camp, and she was my camp counselor, my cabin counselor. And I remember this letter she wrote close to, I guess it was the spring of the following year. And she said, hey, Zoe, I'm leading the 3-week canoe trip this year. I think you would love it. It sounds fantastic. It's a group of 9 people, 9 girls, 2 trippers, 7 girls, and we just paddle on lakes and rivers. It's sunbaking on rocks. It's cruising along in this beautiful area. And she just painted a picture that was fantastic. Well, I went, oh, that's really cool. And I signed up and I went. And that was the change of my life trajectory for sure. So in 1985, that summer, I did a 3-week canoe trip with Patsy as one of my trippers. And it was nothing like she promised. It was hard. It was arduous. It rained pretty much the entire time. She said the last 2 days were sunny. I'm like, I do not have any memories of sun from that trip. And I absolutely loved it. I loved the challenge. I loved the rigor. I loved the discovery. I loved the adventure. I loved the remoteness. I loved hanging out with these other humans and getting to know them and having all these amazing experiences together. And that has formed everything that I've wanted to do ever since, from going on the 6-week canoe trip the following year to working at summer camp to working at Outward Bound here in Australia. to working with the Rural Leadership Foundation and continuing to have wilderness adventures as I did earlier this year, walking the Larapinta Trail. So that was my history with Patsy. And the thing about kindness, and in our conversation this morning, she gave me the gift of feedback, of somebody else's perspective on me. And this is almost 40 years later. And she said, of that year, 1984, when I was a kid at summer camp, she said, "You were memorable. Even way back then, I got a sense from you that of possibility, of impact, of integrity." And I was like blown away by that. I'm like, really? I was just a kid. Like, I had zero self-awareness of the impact I was having on others. And as I thought about this really kind gift of feedback about her perception of me, which is why she wrote me that letter and said, "Hey, come along on this canoe trip." Thought I was a cool kid. It'd be nice to have me on the trip. I just remember that time and not being aware at all of that impact I was having. I remember just doing and saying what I thought was right. And I also remember at times during my teenage years, like many of us, that sometimes I didn't do that. I didn't do things that were right. I didn't say things that were right. I was not always the epitome of light. That's for sure. I think my parents would attest to that. I was a bit of a jerk as a teenager as well. And yet, part of me had this light that I was carrying as well, that Patsy recognized in me and has led her to keep an eye out for me 40 years later. So I think for me, the insight I take from this wonderful interaction with a former summer camp counselor and tripper is that kindness is central to being a great human being. And I think kindness is something I would like to navigate my life with. And I think if all of us pay a little bit more attention of the kindness that we can exhibit to others in small gestures like saying hello and saying thank you and smiling, to showing kindness to plants and animals. I was just looking out the window today. It's raining. It's a bit yucky here. And looking at my tiny little plants that I've planted in my veggie patch and just sending them a thought of, hang in there. It does get better. The sun hopefully will come out soon, and keep growing. So these kind gestures and kind thoughts towards plants and animals, just being gentle is the idea here. And along with that is being kind to self. In many conversations I've had with leaders recently and over the years, we're so bad at being kind to ourselves. We are so harsh about what we need to improve and where our deficits are. And it's like just poking ourselves with a rough stick all the time. And we do such violence to ourselves in all these self-criticisms. And it's deflating. Like I was talking to a leader yesterday and he was saying, "Oh, I'm not there yet with this. I don't have enough self-confidence and it holds me back and I procrastinate." And his visibly contracting, like his shoulders were drooping and he was kind of drooping. And I was like, let's take that idea that you procrastinate and that you don't have self-confidence and actually look at what it offers. And what it offers is the gift of courage. When you don't have self-confidence, you actually maintain humility and curiosity and therefore courage. And so by having this self-doubt all the time, it actually spurs you to be a better leader because you don't fall prey to the traps of power, where hubris is the big trap there, because you stay humble. You know that there's more to learn and more to do. And so we had a look at how we could turn his self-critique into self-appreciation. It's not being Pollyanna, saying, self-doubt is the thing that you need. It's saying it doesn't have to be the thing that holds you back. There is a gift in it, and there are also deficits to that methodology or that mode of being. So let's be kinder to ourselves. And I think in general, we could be a lot kinder to ourselves. We should not do violence to ourselves with the words that we say about ourselves. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't pollute ourselves with unkind words. And in one of the interviews that's coming up in the next season, where the theme is creativity, by the way, have a wonderful conversation with a woman whose name is Nina Simons. I always want to say Nina Simone because her name is one letter off that fabulous singer. So Nina Simons, and she talked about being kind to self and the rituals that we put in place. Because all of this idea of kindness in the little gestures and the little concepts is appreciating that we are all connected to the whole, so that when we pull on one strand of the giant web, which is our connections, is that it does have a reverberation that can be felt worldwide. Now, sometimes that's a big leap for people to think, how I speak to myself got anything to do with world peace? And yet, how is speaking violently to yourself at all helpful towards world peace? So let's start with ourselves and be kind to ourselves. And I have to say, I'm really crap at that. I'm the first one to own it. I am very self-critical, and I catch myself all the time with not appreciating myself, whether it's my physical body or whether it's the performance I had with a client or whether it was a newsletter that I sent out that was kind of meh. These kinds of criticisms don't do us service. Yes, we can critique our work, but we don't have to do it in a violent way. So, message, let's be kind. So coming up this spring, it is spring here in Australia. It's very exciting. The flowers are starting to bloom. My almond tree is going to be out in full force in its beautiful pink blossoms in a week or so, I'm hoping. In my work, I'm doing a lot of work around team culture sessions and team strategy sessions. It's a good time to do it, right? So the energy of spring and renewal and newness and coming out of hibernation and moving towards the summer, it's this creative, dynamic energy. And I'm taking bookings across the spring from September through to December to help teams leverage that energy, get super focused on how they're building their team culture, and also the strategies that they're taking for their organization and teams forward. I love doing that kind of work. The other things that I'm doing is leadership training. That's back on the agenda for people now. So COVID, it's still happening. And yet people are now realizing it's time to get on with it. Let's get back to building capability in teams. So if that's on the agenda for you and your team, sing out. Let's talk. Let's talk about where you're heading and how I might be of service to you. The other personal /professional update, the Olympus Project, my novel. It's nearly ready for pre-orders. Oh my God. This seems to have taken so darn long, much longer than any of my other previous book projects. I'm hoping that's because I'm learning how to do things better. If you want to get on the wait list, the hyperlink is in the show notes, and you'll get the first notification of when pre-orders are out. You'll be able to order, there'll be a short window where you can order collector's edition, where I will sign them up and mail them out personally, and then it'll go up on Amazon for the broader pre-order part of the promotion. So let's talk about next season. I kind of dropped it a little bit, dropped the hint a little bit earlier. The theme is leading change, and in particular, the aspect of leading change that requires creativity. And we are kicking it off next week with the fabulous and fantastic Michael Dixon. I just love this guy. I met him a few years ago, and his energy is just so moving. His mission is really uplifting. So whenever I need a shot of energy and inspiration, I dial in Michael. So that's all coming up next week on the show. I do hope you dial in and listen in to me and Michael as we riff on creativity and passion and purpose. Phew. And if you've been listening to the show for all these nearly 6 years, I so appreciate you. Thank you so much. I do appreciate you digesting everything that we cover on the show and implementing that in your leadership and life. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoe Routh Leadership Podcast with leadership expert Zoe Routh. For more about people stuff and to contact Zoe, go to zoerouth.com.